All right. Hi, everyone. Welcome to Aurelia's Virtual Book Club. We have Kelly McClymer here, and she's going to tell us about her journey writing A Fairy Tale Bride. So, Kelly, do you want to introduce yourself?
Hi, I'm Kelly McClymer. I have been writing for a very long time, and I don't quite want to say how long, but I will say I started out writing short science fiction stories, and I did that for quite a while. And then I started noticing that all the comments I got was, this should be a novel. This isn't long enough. This doesn't really have an ending. And, I was talking to other writers, so I was like, well, how should it end? What am I doing wrong? And I wasn't getting good answers. So I decided that I read romance, and romance has a happy ending, so it has to be ended a good ending. So I'm like, all right, I'm going to try writing romance. And I wrote one, which will never see the light of day, all the way through to the end. And again, I was told, well, this is kind of not an ending. And I'm like, how can it not be an ending? They're together. So I wrote another one, and I finally sold it. And it turned out, since my heroine had 5 sisters and a brother, I think, no, there's 6 of, I always get that wrong. I think there's 6 girls. No, there's 5 girls and 1 boy. So my heroine, her sisters, and one brother. So Kate Duffy bought it for Kensington, and she said, and can you just tell me what the stories are for the other siblings, which I had never really considered. So I quickly wrote quick little 2-paragraph stories for the other siblings. I made it easy for myself. I was thinking ahead. All of the siblings have names from Shakespeare's characters. So I just went and looked at what their original stories were, and it's like, okay. And since it was called The Fairy Tale Bride, and it was built around fairy tales, I also just looked at fairy tales and said, okay, who's going to be this fairy tale? This. And I wrote my little things. And then all 7 of those books got published, and I have had my rights back and put them out for myself. And in that other time, not being good at focus, I've also written young adult romance and young adult fantasy. And I'm currently writing contemporary cozy momlet mystery, is what I call it, with a mom who's a secret shopper and solves a few mysteries along the way. But that first novel that I finally figured out how to have an ending that everybody knew, okay, this is an ending. Of course, they asked for more books in the series, but they did think the novel ended. So I feel like I accomplished something in that journey.
Yeah.
And I'm still writing, and I plan to write until I fall down in the street and don't think anymore.
So A Fairy Tale Bride was this first book that you're talking about, right?
It was.
Okay.
It was my first book that got published. And I'm trying to think how to explain, because now we're in the indie publishing world where you can put your book out and test it against readers.
You transitioned that book from the traditional publisher to indie. Like, how did that transition work for you?
Well, it's an interesting history lesson. Since it's a historical romance, I guess I can go do a little history with it. So the first time I sold it, now I love all my books. When I'm finished writing them, I love them. I think everyone should read them and love them too. But I also know that is a fairy tale of its own. So when I sold it, it was a huge, huge deal, because I didn't really understand the world of publishing, and I didn't really understand how many frustrations were going to come. But I had finished it. Someone else said it was great. An editor looked at it, bought it, and published it. So I thought I made it. But what it turns out, the lesson I learned and continue to keep learning, is that you never really make it as a writer. Even Stephen King I'm guessing, doesn't really feel like he's made it as a writer, because every new book is a new mountain to climb, and you may not make it.
Mm-hmm.
But I didn't know that at the time, so I thought I made it. I was all woohoo, woohoo. I was all happy. But it turned out that it didn't. It sold okay, sold enough for them to buy 6 more books from me, but it didn't sell enough to make me a bestseller or a household name. And so what happens when that happens is the books, they're still for sale. Some places, mainly used bookstores, but on your publisher site, but they're not around anymore. So you can't do anything with them. And it's like, you go, oh, they didn't make it, poor things. And then along comes Amazon and Kindle. And it's like, well, if you have books that nobody can buy because they're not anywhere where they can buy them, you can put them on Amazon as an ebook. And I thought, but nobody was buying them then. Would anyone buy them now? Answer, yes. Short answer, yes. Long answer, what I had to do was contact my publisher and get my rights back. This was back in the beginning, 2010, before publishers realized they maybe shouldn't be giving the rights to ebooks back quite
so you were really lucky.
So I got them back. And then I had to scan in every single page, and this required something very painful. So I had 25 copies of the book from my publisher that I still had a few copies, and I had to pull them apart, and I hated that. I hate to make the book look red at all, but I had to do it. So I had to pull every page apart and run it through a special scanner that I bought for that. Then I had to go back through and clean up all the scans, because L's sometimes turn into ones, and all sorts of really weird stuff that you can't quite see visually because the scanner is not 100% perfect. And in the process, it was very interesting. I started to realize the opportunity I had, which was I could fix a few things that I didn't like. And I've never met a paragraph that I couldn't revise and edit a little bit, which is always very dangerous. And in our new digital world, it's really, really dangerous for authors like me. So I fixed the books up and I put them out, and they found a whole new audience. They continue to find new readers, which makes me so, so, so happy. And I decided this is the way to go. So this is what I do now, as I put my books out in ebook form, and my mysteries are now in paperback, which is great. And I have audiobooks for the first 6 of the Fairy Tale Bride is the first in the Once Upon a Wedding series. And so I have audiobooks for the first 6 of those. My narrator disappeared on book 7, so I still have to get that one done. Sorry about that. And it's so different that the journey, I think, still continues, because I get asked fairly often to do book 8, which would be Betsy's story. Sorry, I blanked on her name for a second. And I started Betsy's story, but I never finished it. And I don't write historical romance right now. So what I'm doing is I'm looking for a co-writer who will write further books in that series with me, sort of along the lines of the way Sean Platt and Johnny Truant and Dave, I'm forgetting his last name, work, as opposed to what other authors do, which is hire like a ghostwriter or a co-writer and they have complete control. I'm looking for someone who wants more of a partnership, a long-term partnership, and maybe to experiment with other things. I haven't found that person yet. I think it's probably, I'm trying to be patient. I think it's probably going to take time.
Yeah. Well, and
But
it
I
might
do
be
think,
someone who's like been writing for themselves for a long time but hasn't been publishing for a while, right? Because you want someone whose
yeah,
writing is as developed as where the series is right now.
well, exactly. And even someone with, is one of the problems I have is that with romance, I've kind of gotten jaded. And I
Yeah.
don't,
Uh-oh, you froze.
oh, you're back. Okay.
Oh, you're back. Good.
Oh, I was gone. I'm sorry. I couldn't tell. I could see your picture,
Well,
but I
it
couldn't.
looked like it looked like you were gone. Yeah, I was about to say though that like that's exactly why I refuse to pick one genre to start with. I mean, almost everything falls into fantasy, but like it's different parts of fantasy so that I don't get bored. Um, but you inadvertently picked like the perfect time to put your romance on Amazon because the first e-reader adopters were the romance readers. So that
I
was
was
really
very
lucky for
lucky.
you.
I will never discount the luck. Um, you know, romance readers like to read romance. They like the happy ending. And since
Yeah.
this was the first book where I actually had an ending that was known as an ending, I do feel like it was a good match.
Yeah. So did writing the romance series help you figure out how to write endings for the fantasy
No,
ones?
no.
No?
That's
Uh-oh.
why I decided I'm writing a serialization. My new enterprise in the fall is a serialization fantasy.
Okay.
And I won't have to write an ending, a real ending, for 3 years because there are 3 segments to this fantasy serialization, and there are 16 episodes to each segment. So I can write cliffhangers for the next 3 years, which makes me happy. I do think I know how I want it to end. Whether readers will be satisfied with the ending is another issue, but I don't have to worry
But
about
if
it for
it's
three
more of an
years.
ending than all the other cliffhangers, they can't really be mad, right?
I hope not.
I
And if
mean,
they were mad,
maybe it's a relative thing. I don't know. The
if
one,
they were mad, I would revisit the issue because that's what you can do in the digital world.
yeah. I was watching Lie to Me a few, I don't know, maybe like a year ago or something. And I got so mad because the last episode of the last season that they actually produced is like a worse cliffhanger than any other cliffhanger in the entire series.
I agree with
And you
you.
sit there and you're like, but he finally like admitted that he might be in love with this person that you've known he's had like feelings for the whole like for 4 seasons. He's like finally admitted it to himself that he has feelings for her. And then he doesn't get the opportunity to actually do anything about it. So you don't find out like does he do anything about it? Does he want to do anything about it? Like there's
Well,
no
you raise an interesting question. Is there any fan fiction about that?
I don't know.
Did any viewer go
I'm not a
and
fan fiction discoverer.
close it? No, I don't know where to go to look for fan fiction.
I mean, all
I've
of the
heard
fan fiction
about
I've come across is like terrible and makes no sense.
it. I don't know.
I was
I
I
hear
was on
about it.
some website somewhere and I saw something about like it was Harry Potter fan fiction and it was like a chase scene and like but it was magic, but it was like magic from like Tolkien's world put into Harry Potter. It made no sense. It was so confusing. That was my one brush with fanfic.
Right. Well, I think fan fiction is usually first draft.
Yeah, but it still didn't make any sense even as a first draft.
I don't know because 50 Shades, that came from fan fiction.
That
So I
came
assume some of it's got to be really
yeah,
good.
so and I did read that, and it didn't read like fan fiction. I mean, you could get the illusions. It read like you know how people change like Shakespeare into things like 10 Things I Hate About You. Um, it felt more like that
Oh,
than it
interesting.
did like fan fiction to me.
So like paying homage to some great writer's
Yeah.
storyline.
Yeah. So like if you had read both, you would get the references. But if you'd never heard of The Taming of the Shrew and you watched 10 Shades of Grey, 10 Things I Hate About You, if you watch 10 Things I Hate About You and you don't have any experience with Shakespeare, you'd think it was this awesome thing that was brand new.
Okay.
You
All
see what
right.
I mean?
I do. I do.
Yeah.
And I mean, to be fair, I mean, it's like there are some famous examples of that, like West Side Story and Romeo and Juliet,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
it's making the story more modern and more relatable for people who don't really get why the
Yeah.
Capulets and the
Well, and basically they're
Montagues hated
doing
each
it.
other.
So I did a lot of acting in middle school and high school, and I did a lot of Shakespeare acting because we had a really good Shakespeare theater that had a very good educational program. So we would never set any of our Shakespeare plays during actual Shakespearean time. Like we did
Mhm.
Othello and we set it in the South in the 60s
Oh,
on like
cool.
a military compound.
And so did you rewrite the lines or did you use the same
We
lines
used the
but
same lines, but the like set and the costumes and like the music that we put to transition the scenes and everything was was 60s stuff. Like we did a lot of oh what's it called? I'm totally blanking on the word.
I know I've seen stuff like that. I didn't
You
realize it
know
had a name.
those like songs that the slaves would sing during the Underground Railroad to like signal to each other.
Hmm.
I'm like blanking on the name of what those songs are, but we did a lot of those as part of our transitions between
Oh,
scenes.
interesting. That
Yeah,
sounds
so we
really
did like
interesting.
Wade in the Water and a couple others. Um,
Get you
yeah,
thinking about the
yeah,
similarities between the two um,
exactly.
stories.
Yeah.
Interesting.
And it sort of forces you to understand what you're saying because you're using archaic language in a modern setting. So you have to know how the archaic language applies to the modern setting. Um, yeah, it was awesome. It was a lot of
Yeah,
fun. But I don't think we
I would
set
think that would
anything in
make you
like
think.
ancient times.
But I
Yeah.
would think that would make, well, I don't know, slave South. That seems like ancient times when when you're in fifth grade. I mean, your parents seem ancient to you when you're that
I
age.
think for me it like adjusted my what is ancient times to like Victorian was like ancient times and before that was like ancient times and then everything after that was like modern. But I'm backwards and old fashioned in a lot of ways. So.
I always try and think like who's the oldest person, because every so often they'll do a story on the oldest person. I think that one of the oldest people just recently died who was like 112. And so
Mm-hmm.
then I think, okay, so what has she experienced as new in her lifetime? And it's mind-boggling when you just do that experiment. Just for someone, I
Yeah,
mean, 112, and she seemed to have been, pretty with it for most of those
yeah.
years. And
Even my grandmother, like, it's amazing. All of the
well,
changes in technology from the 20s to now,
I
like,
saw a really
crazy.
funny meme go through. All my cousins shared it. Uh, when I was, you think you have it hard. When I was your age, I had to walk um, through 9 feet through 9 feet shag carpet to change the channel or something like that. I'm getting it a little wrong, but it was like, oh, I relate. I remember those ancient times.
Yeah, yeah.
Shag carpet and having to actually go over to the television to change the channel.
The next time I'm at my grandmother's house, I should take a picture of her carpet because you would appreciate it. It's like they bought the house, I think, in the early 60s, and the whole downstairs is carpeted. It's like a mustardy yellow, but it's got a pattern of like turquoise and brown and black and white. Like
See,
It's
okay,
one of
so
those sort of Art Nouveau patterns, which if the color palette had been more fortunate, it would actually look good.
I've been
But
attractive.
she's never changed it because she's grown used to it.
But you
And
have to understand, the
yeah.
whole reason for shag carpet was to try and hide the dirt and stains that naturally collect on the carpet. And so
Yeah.
that is what drives carpet manufacturing, is how do we make this carpet not look dirty? It sounds like they didn't quite
Yeah.
succeed, but they tried all those different
Yeah.
colors. How would you
The
ever
only
see
good thing
anything?
about that carpet is that it's not actually shag.
Oh, okay. But you
It's just like
still,
the
you could put
colors
it
of,
into a hospital and it
yeah.
would not show the dirt. Yeah, no, I know. I always see all
I've grown
those
fond
great
of
pictures of
no
rooms
carpets.
with like white carpets and white furniture and all this glass. And my eye is very drawn to them. I would love to have a room like that if I didn't have
Yeah.
to clean it, you know.
Yeah.
That I feel like it could really stay clean. I would love a room like that.
Yeah.
But I would never own one
For it to stay
because
clean, you need to not have white carpet. You need like white tile or something on the floor
yeah, white
with
tile
like
would be okay
white
because you
with
could sweep it.
white.
Yeah.
Yeah. Or and you could get those like little carpets, the like area rugs, so that you can like put them in the wash, like actual wash, not
Or pick them
just
up and
like
throw them away if they're disgusting.
yeah. Yeah.
If you have animals or anything.
Yeah. Okay. So for your first romance, what made you pick historical?
Um, I really like, so first thing I should admit, because it confuses some readers I know. When I originally wrote The Fairy Tale Bride, I wrote it to be a Regency romance because I really liked the formality
Mm-hmm.
of the Regency, and it was just expanding into allowing a little bit more open bedroom door, and I thought that was
Mm-hmm.
fun. So when they bought it, they said, "Oh, we have enough Regencies. Can you make this a Victorian?" And I'm like, "Sure, no problem," because um, I I really love Victorian history, and so I knew a lot
Mm-hmm.
about it. What I didn't know was, how hard it is to change, because sometimes when you create a plot in you're using the conventions of the times,
Mm-hmm.
well, the conventions shift. So it was interesting because it made me look harder. It's kind of the way you were talking about setting a Shakespearean play in a different time setting makes you look a little harder at what every
Mm-hmm.
line is saying and what the tensions are underneath. And that's what happened to me when I had to revise it from Regency to Victorian. And one of the things I did, because I knew that I was going to be writing more books in the series, it's like, okay, I'm not going to get myself into too much trouble. So I started it right as Victoria got on the throne. So
Okay.
I still allowed it to be in that little between Regency and Victorian
Mm-hmm.
period, and I didn't have to change too many of the conventions at that point.
Yeah.
Um, which was interesting because one of the things about Victorian England is that those are the women who started agitating for
Yeah. I wrote a
more
whole
women's rights.
report on it in European history. Yeah. Like my term paper for that class was how did Victoria being a queen instead of a king influence the original women's rights movement? So
Which is
I'm
really
I'm a huge fan
interesting.
of Victorian history too.
And it's one of the things we don't, as women, we don't really know the history of how women
Well,
actually
especially as
finally.
American women, because most schools don't teach you anything about European history. So most people think that feminism started in like the 60s and the 50s, but really it started
Well, the
almost
basic
100
thing
years
was get the
earlier.
right.
But
Well, actually, women have agitated, and what I've learned, because my serialization has me looking at history and prehistory,
mm-hmm,
looking at these issues. And one of the things I've seen is there's a cycle where women um, start to agitate for uh, rights and being able to have a say and
mm-hmm,
governance, shared governance. And then something bad happens, and all of a sudden women are back to not having the shared governance, and then they go back and they do it again. So it's kind of a cycle.
Mm-hmm.
And it's really interesting. It's like one of the things about the witch hunts
Mm-hmm.
that we kind of know in the back of our mind. It was a way to push back against women who were advocating for their own power.
Yeah.
And we don't think about it. It grabs our attention in a different way. But for me, I'd already known. I mean, in the Regency, women did some unusual things too. There was
Yeah.
a lot of freedom. I mean, in some ways, the Regency for women was a little bit like the 60s, not quite, but there was just a little taking off the reins. But in the Victorian times, when that got constricted, well,
Mm-hmm.
women got a little annoyed. It's like
Mm-hmm.
it's like if we tried to take away the right to vote for women in America right now,
Yeah.
we'd have some really angry women on our hands,
Yeah.
and there'd be some pushback from it. But depending on who took it away and how much power they had, we might not get the right to vote back. We'd just be really annoyed about it. And what
Mm-hmm.
happens um, okay, I'm talking like a teacher, sorry, but one of the things I find interesting is that what happens is then you get these poles. So you have the pole of this perfect saintly woman, the
Mm-hmm.
keeper of the home, the tender, the one who, you know, devotes herself to her husband when he walks in the door after a hard day's work or hard days at the club or whatever
Mm-hmm.
he's done, and tends her children. And then you have the smart woman who is capable of running a business or being practical. Um, and those two don't always line up in the
Yeah.
societal eye. It's like,
Yeah.
and we don't want to get into women who like don't want to stay with abusive husbands. I forget. I should have looked up the name of that author. I don't know, was it Margaret Gaskell or one
Elizabeth
of
Gaskell. I think
Elizabeth
her name is
Gaskell?
Elizabeth Gaskell. I love her.
I
She
think,
wrote Wives and Daughters. I was just about to ask you if you read any of her stuff while you were doing research because
but
her
isn't she the one
stuff is
that she
perfect.
was married and had a bunch of kids, and then her husband was a jerk, and
I
so she was
don't
like,
know. I don't know
"I'm
her
done with
story.
you," and it ended up, I can't remember because it was one of those Victorian writers, and it ended up that he controlled all her money. She made all the money. He controlled all the money. Um, and she just,
Yeah.
because she was like a writing machine. She was like the Nora
Yeah.
Roberts of her time.
Well, and that still can be an issue in some states in the US today because some states are not communal property states. So, like Indiana, for example, your husband owns everything you have.
Really?
Yeah.
I did not know that. I don't even want to know. La la la. I don't want to know that that's true
Yeah,
still
but
today.
it's still it's still sometimes a problem where the guy who's doing horrible things. Let's see what Wikipedia says about Elizabeth Gaskell. She's one of my favorites. I love Wives and Daughters and North and South, and those are both like exactly about that
And
tension between the quote unquote perfect woman and the woman who's actually useful in real life. And I think, well, anyway, the picture from the stories that I've read that are written by Victorians is that the practical ones were more sought after because they were actually useful in real life, and the other ones were like if you got one of the ones that was quote unquote perfect, she ended up being useless because no business sense.
well, exactly. No actual practical sense. She was just an ornament, kind of more like the
Exactly.
trophy wife than the actual
Yeah.
first wife.
And it's
I used
kind of
to.
funny because I think there's still that dichotomy in society today.
Mhm, I think so.
Yeah. Yeah.
I find it funny. Well, I think one of the things that I keep learning and I keep trying to drill down is there are certain personalities, and sometimes we have these prejudices, and we're like, okay, we want to put people in boxes, neat, tidy boxes, rather than the messy little multiple boxes and rabbit holes they actually inhabit. And so we will say this person is flighty or um, impractical
Mm-hmm.
when they are in some ways but not in others. We can't all be perfect, but I always feel for the women who are all laced up in, and I know there are women who actually choose to wear corsets now. I am not one of them, but I understand the appeal of having like a nice curvy little waist, even if it's forced curvy. But when it wasn't a choice, when it was, scandalous if you didn't wear a corset,
yeah. Well, and
even if it hampered what you were doing.
So I, being crazy and do everything, I make corsets sometimes. And if I'm ever making a strapless dress, I have to build a corset into it, because the only way for a strapless dress to actually stay up and be comfortable is if the weight is resting on your waist. And the only way to transfer that and keep the top half of it up is to use some boning. But the boning that I use is metal boning. It's thin and it's flexible, and once, like, if the dress has been made to fit you, it's very comfortable. Really as much boning as they would have in the corsets times. And whalebone, which is what they did use, is much, much stiffer and more restricting than the like thin metal stuff that I use now. So a lot of the modern corsets, they don't even use, like, commercially produced corsets don't use metal boning. They use plastic boning, which I think is terrible, because the plastic,
there's not much give in that, is it?
well, no, it's just as flexible when you're like working with it as the metal. But when you've been wearing something that's got plastic boning in it for 2 hours, the plastic bends and the middle part like sticks out, and the top part and the bottom part poke into you. And
Ouch.
it's so painful. That's why I wear, if I'm gonna put boning in something, I always pick the metal, because it's flexible enough to be comfortable and you can bend over. And like
I took a
everything.
corset workshop one time for writers, and it was really interesting, because they said once you get used to it, it can be really comfortable, and
and
it
if it's
can be
made to fit you, it's very comfortable. If it's not made to fit you, then it's not comfortable. So like a lot of,
well, these
even the
people had
modern
all
ones,
made their own.
Yeah, so the way that I make design clothing and the way that the Victorians design clothing are the same, because my method was developed in the 1800s, in France. So the part, like nowadays you go to the store and you buy like a dress, and if it's like for something really fancy, you have to go get it tailored,
Right.
because everything off the rack doesn't fit you.
No, isn't going to fit you right. Yeah.
Right. Back then, it didn't matter how wealthy or poor you were, whether you were making your dress or someone else was. The fit was built in from the beginning, until they developed the big sewing factories. And The Dressmaker is an awesome novel to read if you're interested in that sort of thing.
No, I have read it. I know. It was fascinating. Because I live in the Northeast, and we have the big mill fire that actually got some of those girls the rights, because they were actually locked. They were chain locked, padlocked into the mill, so none of them could escape the fire. So it was a pretty big, every time you press on a fire exit door, you have them to thank, all the young women who died because their employers didn't want them to sneak out for a smoke or to chat up some handsome young guy. But and speaking of disruptive technologies, that was a very disruptive technology, because being a seamstress was a job for women, one of the few jobs for women.
And it was a job for women since Venice in the Middle Ages.
Oh,
they hired all the women in Venice to make all the sails for their ships in their like big armadas, like back when Venice was the superpower.
I mean, I do remember reading all of those. I mean, one of the things that was important for Victorian young ladies was to be able to sew and to make the right neat stitches. And I remember trying to imagine if I could have done it. I'm like, I don't think.
Oh, you can. Everyone can. It's not
those ones
it's
who
not
would have been
hard
clumsy.
to do. It just takes practice, like anything else. Like if you want to write by hand pretty, then you spend like an hour a day writing by hand and making it as pretty as you can. And then after like 2 months, then you're good at it.
Well, you're
It's the
good at
same
it,
thing with
but I don't
sewing.
want to be good at something. I want to be great at something. I want to not get my hand smacked because I
Okay,
made
so
a
you
mistake
want
on
to
the
be
letter.
great at it, so months instead of 2.
Yeah, maybe a few years.
No, sewing is much, much more straightforward than you think it is. I promise.
It
I've
is funny
taught
because
people how.
it would
It's
have been a
much,
skill that
yeah.
we would have known very, very well. Like I had a friend
It still baffles me
who
when people
mentioned
can't.
darning socks for her
Oh yeah,
husband and
yeah,
sons. And I was like, oh, I didn't know you could still do that on modern socks, which is kind of, duh. But I mean, we just threw our socks out or we
yeah.
used them as
So
rags.
the thing is, like with the big industrial knitting machines and stuff that came about as part of the Industrial Revolution, they they were able to knit like thinner thread and more finely, which is why they were able,
Ah,
and
okay.
with the advent of like technology to make polyester, they were able to make nylons that were actually nylon, which is why they're called nylons. But before that, like
Silk
you
stockings and
had to
all,
be
yeah.
an aristocrat to afford those, and the ones that were easier to darn were actually knit with much bigger yarn, so it was more cost effective to darn it and fix the holes than to completely redo the entire sock. Whereas now it's cheaper to just go buy a new pair.
Exactly. And I think that's part of the disruptive technology is they take something that
Yeah,
you took for granted, and
yeah.
they change it
And I think things are
completely.
going sort of backwards now with the trend in made to measure clothing and stuff. It's really interesting
Well,
because back in the 1800s, every single like fashion house had their own method for pattern drafting. So there's like a ton of different ways you can do it, and it's
oh, am I losing you? Because I
no,
do
you're
think,
still here.
okay, because I do think that you're right in one way that we are, because what we did is we went so far to the
Yeah,
disposable side, and we're like,
yeah,
well, it doesn't really make sense that we're buying new things all the time. We should have clothes that persist, that last through the years. And that does require, if you're going to have a dress that you're going to wear for 10 years, you want it to be tailored to you and perhaps retailored to you periodically as your shape
yeah,
changes
yeah.
and,
Well, and
and not be
I
so
think there's
disposable.
like there's benefits to things being made, and there's benefits to things being mass produced. And I think happening now is that people are trying to figure out how to combine the technology, the like software side of things and the hardware side of things and the manufacturing side of things to get the best of both of those.
Well, the 3D printers, at the moment, they're still not as disruptive as they have the potential to be. But just like with e-publishing,
Yeah,
I think
it takes
3D printers are going to uh, be extremely disruptive within the next 10
oh
years.
yeah, I'm super excited. There's a company that does computer aided design. Like you can make the technical drawings that are the things you would have to send to the 3D printer. There's a company called Onshape that lets you make those drawings, and you can sign up for a free account. And if you're going to make a ton of things, then you can like pay for an account, but it's on the cloud. So I'm super excited about this. I'm totally going to start figuring out this. Hey,
It's
I'm
right
an
up your alley.
engineer. I like these things. Yeah, and then you just send the files to the 3D printer, and then they mail you like your prototype. And I kind of want to do some little like, I don't know, like little models of some of the things that I make and some of my not Sorceress and Beastly, but the one that comes after that, the exclusives. That one is all science fiction. So I want some of my cool little gadgets. I want like little prototypes, even if they don't work, but like little things that I can maybe sell on my site or something. I don't know.
Well,
Along the lines of like
the
those
other cool
Doctor
thing though is
Who sonic screwdrivers.
right, right, sonic screwdrivers. But I was going to say the thing with 3D printing, because you don't have to make them ahead of time, is you can actually allow some customization. So, like you know,
Yeah.
on the side of Doctor Who's sonic screwdriver, somebody could say, this is the property of Timmy, you know? It's like, so Timmy knows it's his sonic screwdriver
Yeah.
or
Or I could
whatever.
I could digitize my signature and make my signature engraved on it or something. I don't
Yeah, that would be so
know.
cool. I mean, look, all these little things you could, yeah.
Yeah, so many little things. I should probably make one of the things I should make is probably a little scale model of the airship that everyone is on during that story. But this is supposed to be about your story, so
Oh, but this is more interesting because now I'm picturing you don't want to do a little scale model. You want to do like instead of a dollhouse, you want to do like a space house and have the people go through, and you can
yeah,
make
I
all
have
the
to
little.
design the thing first, though.
Oh, once you design it on paper, it's much easier to design it.
Yeah.
But
Um.
I mean, the possibilities. I mean, I just see this as being so disruptive in the future in a really cool way. But yeah, I never thought about that before. I mean, that's what something I could do is I could create, you know, my once upon a time manor house and populate it with my characters and have all the old fashioned furniture and things in it. I
That would be
loved
really
dollhouses when I
cool.
was a kid. I know I loved dollhouses when I was a kid,
Me too.
but you know, I'm not visually good at that kind of stuff, so
Mm.
it would be very boring. I would have to get someone who's good at that to create it. But just the whole idea is kind of cool that you could do something that customized.
Yeah. Um. So back to your book that we're gonna read. um. What what where'd it go? Um. So if it were gonna be made into a movie, who would you cast? Tough question, I know.
It is a really tough question because I don't usually start with actors. I know some people will start with actors for and I have done that occasionally, but it's just not that's just not once I create a character, they kind of come to life for me on the page and they just sort of
Mm-hmm.
it's like I know their mind and then I sort of build from the outside in. But if I were
Mm-hmm.
going to think of an actress who I think is a lot like Miranda, I'd probably pick somebody like and she's a little too old to play Miranda, but her type, like a Sandra Bullock type, who's
Mm.
you know a little
Like
bit
maybe her when she
clumsy.
was young
Yeah,
in
exactly.
Practical Magic, maybe.
Perfect. That's a perfect example of practical magic because she's a little bit clumsy and awkward, but really good-hearted and
Mm-hmm.
you know very much of a caretaker for everybody. And she's got a smile that you know makes other people feel good and in a little bit of mischief in her.
Mm-hmm.
So even though she doesn't have the right color hair, that would be who I would think
That's
would
easy to
represent
change.
it.
Movie producers can fix that sort of thing. It
That's
always
true.
annoys me actually when they give someone a wig to make their hair color right, but don't give them colored contact lenses to make their eye color right.
Right, because they can.
That
It's
really bugs me.
I mean the technology is there. I know somebody who did that,
It's so
who
easy.
got
You
violet
go
colored
to a
eyes
thrift
just because
store
she
and you
liked
buy them
them.
for like $5.
Yeah, I
Yeah,
mean you
I
just
had a
do it
friend
just
in
for
high
fun.
school who did that. Yeah, there's no excuse, people. Make their eyes be the right color.
Well, I wonder if it doesn't show up well on camera. That's the only thing I could think of.
Well, but they do close-ups and stuff, and I have one friend who her eyes were like a gray blue, and she would always wear green ones, and you could not tell that you could maybe if you did it really, really up close, you could tell that she was wearing contacts. You could
Hmm.
not tell that they were colored.
So it does make you wonder
Everyone
why they
just,
don't.
yeah. Anyway,
We'll have to
um,
ask somebody.
we will. We'll have to find a person and a movie producer. I don't know any movie
I
producers.
don't know. I know some indie movie producers, but
I know some
I know they would
who
tell me
want to
that they
be
didn't have contacts
screenwriters,
in
but
their
I don't
budget.
know. But it's anyway. Um,
I'm
so
throwing you off. I'm sorry.
no, it's okay. I never stay on topic anyway. Um, but so you mentioned a little bit before that you had to switch from Regency to Victorian, but like how do the events that actually took place during that early Victorian time influence the story at all?
I think that I didn't allow it to influence the story too much. I think that I love historicals that are really steeped in history, but I didn't feel comfortable. Like I would have needed to know the history a lot more to really feel like I was going to steep it.
Mm-hmm.
So the way that I looked at it was more along the lines of women starting to recognize that they were getting the short end of the stick
Mm-hmm.
and that maybe they should do something about it. Because one of the tensions, I think, and this is what I like about romances in set in any era, is that there is a tension, an unacknowledged tension, I think, sometimes between men and women, um, that derives from that power imbalance.
Mm-hmm.
And
Yeah.
so going back to the Victorian time when women were more clearly,
Mm-hmm.
you know, had less
Yeah.
of the power, but yet still didn't. Because that's the interesting thing to me, is that women have been running the world while men have been busy erasing their names and erasing the women's names and putting their own names on top of things. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
it's a very interesting dynamic. And there's times when I just look at the history and think, so why have women allowed this? Why are we okay with this? In, why have men thought this was a good idea? So being able to play in that playground and try and create a couple who, despite the outside society, can come to an equal partnership where they
Mm-hmm.
value each other. I think that's one of the values of reading romance, is that you see that played out over and over again in the different romances.
Yeah.
Not all romances
Yeah.
have that dynamic. Some romances have, where the woman enjoys being taken care of and not having power. Although
Yeah.
I don't
Well, and
read
that's
those
like a
very much. So.
personality choice. I don't either, actually. But I think it's really interesting because I think a lot of people in real life have very negative examples of what a good relationship should be. I think like whether it's their parents who stay together for reasons that are really old-fashioned and make no sense, or who are just in bad situations in the first place. There's a lot of people who are not encouraged to read because of their socioeconomic status. And those are the people who could really benefit from reading romances because then they would get the examples of this is what a relationship should be, and they could actually learn and then get themselves out of that negative cycle. So I think
Yeah, and
I
not
think
only that
there's a
though,
place for romance besides just, being fun.
but there's a place in romance, or there's an element in romance that says the female person matters, that the female person has power and can use it well or poorly in the relationship and in life.
Mm-hmm.
And
Yeah.
you often don't see that in more mainstream stories. I mean, you can definitely see it in cozy
Yeah.
mysteries. I mean, Miss Marple has a lot of self-agency. Of course, she's older,
Yeah.
so we
But I
we
think
let older
I
women.
think the converse is true as well, right? Like I think a lot of especially the historical, I think is definitely more clear to a reader from the historical ones, but you can see how a guy can be like chivalrous without being domineering. Do you know what I mean?
I do. It's
Like
not.
it's
Yes,
not one or the other, right? Like you can be gentlemanly and not be oppressive of the people you're being gentlemanly towards.
exactly. Like my husband can open more jars than I can open. so when I ask him to open a jar, he's not like, oh, you dainty little thing. He's like, okay, I can apply more pressure to this jar. I'll open it. I could buy a
Yeah.
machine that would do that.
Yeah.
It's not like he's got some kind of, godlike
Yeah.
power that he can
Yeah.
open this jar. But I surely appreciate that I don't have to buy the machine, and I can just hand him the jars that I can't open.
Yeah.
And that's kind of like it's a working relationship, because there's like, he's not particularly good at fine motor skills. I said that backwards. That's interesting. At fine motor skills, I'm better. So I write the envelopes when we're mailing things out. I write the cards when we're mailing things out. We'll decide what to say together, and then I'll write it. No biggie. It's not like, oh, you're such a Neanderthal, you can't write with a nice calligraphy or anything. And I just think we're hampered sometimes by our prejudice of like, all men are this way, all women are that way.
Yeah.
And I do think that romances really are the place where you explore that, or women can explore that in a kind of a safe manner. You can find any kind of woman, any kind of man.
Mm-hmm.
And I have not read the 50 Shades books, but I've read a lot of people talking about them, and I did think it was interesting.
Yeah,
that
the controversy about it is definitely, I mean, I don't think they're bad books, but the controversy about them is definitely well-founded.
And what I
on
find
all
interesting
sides of the argument.
And what I find interesting is the tension between the readers who say, this is her journey to take her own power and civilize him. And that's a little bit strong.
That's definitely how I read it. Yeah.
Yes. And the women who say, oh, she should have kicked him to the curb. And I'm like, so I understand those people who are like, oh, it should be kicked to the curb. Do anything wrong, you're kicked to the curb. I'm like, well, eventually the curb is going to get full of people being kicked to the curb, because there are plenty of times in my life when I should have been kicked to the curb. Fortunately, people didn't kick me to the curb. They were like, hello, you want to fix that,
Yeah.
And, they gave me a shot. They gave me a second chance, which is one of the things that is always in my writing. And especially in The Fairy Tale Bride is, there's always hope. You just sometimes you have to do some hard work. Sometimes you have to do some hard work on yourself. Sometimes you have to be, okay, this person is this way because of this. I can't expect them to live up to my standards.
Yeah. I think there's also, there's a train.
It almost sounded like music. It was like an orchestra getting started.
It was actually a pretty train sound. I like trains. They're my second favorite form of transportation. But there's like, I think with 50 Shades, and I think this is true of a lot of other romances that aren't as well known, but I think there's a lot of like wishfulness between like readers who want to be the person who can change the other person. And I think that's one of the reasons why 50 Shades became so popular, because first of all, it was teaching people about a segment of sexuality that they didn't know because it wasn't mainstream.
Right.
It wasn't like, you weren't allowed to talk about that sort of stuff in the mainstream before that book.
Exactly.
I mean, it was a taboo subject until that book, which is, I think that's one of the good things.
That is one of the benefits, yes, of that book.
Despite how inaccurate a lot of it was, the fact that it's, a topic of discussion now is a good thing. But I think a lot of people like want to be the person who changes the bad boy into a good boy. I mean, that's what like Crybaby is all about.
And no, I really do think, and I think just okay, so here I go being all academic again, but so that's a really interesting zeitgeist, and that's in a lot of current fairy tales, current versions of fairy tale, and it wasn't
Beauty and the Beast for sure,
and it wasn't so much it wasn't so much in the older versions, some of the more ancient versions, where it was more about the girl getting her own power. And so that's an example of what happens when you're in a society that's more on the patriarchal side, is that female power is expressed through male action. So every female needs a male in order to complete her she won't be an effective actor without the male. And that is something that still bothers me about our worldview is, I really think that no one works well in isolation, or that's a little absolutist, but few people work well in isolation. We're all better when we have, other people helping us, supporting us, working with us, showing us where we're, maybe not seeing the whole picture. Like you need a bunch of mirrors to drive a car right, because otherwise you're gonna miss things. And I think the same's true for people. But with our society, we're so focused on women having a man so that, so that she's complete. And even now we still are. And that kind of bothers me, because I go back and I read the Victorian literature, and it has just a slightly different feel to it than because it was written by women who were actually going through the oppression. And right now, well, in America, we're not really going through that much oppression. Everything we're going through is there. I mean, there is oppression, but everybody has to deal with that. I mean, I'm not saying we couldn't be a more equal society, but in a lot of ways, as a woman, if you wanted to go off and just be on your own and never have to see or deal with a man, unless, it's like your banker or whatever, you're fine. You can do that. You can survive and have a nice life. That wasn't always true. I mean, one of the things when you look at the way the Victorians are set up is a woman would not survive very well without a man. She immediately becomes prey. And it was one of the things they used to do in the Regency and Victorian times is, daughters of wealthy people, would be preyed upon by lesser sons or nobles who didn't have.
Like Mr. Wickham in Pride and Prejudice, or even Mr. Collins.
Exactly, and then some of them would be drugged and married, and they were stuck. That was it. Too bad you're married. I'm like, okay, that doesn't make any sense.
Oh man, I'm gonna look it up right now. I read a really good, I think it was either Regency or Victorian, I don't remember, but it was a really good one. It's about these two twins, but nobody knows. Like, one twin is quiet and bookish and like has glasses, and the other one is like doesn't have glasses and like is the perfect social butterfly. And the perfect social butterfly has like gone through this whole thing to get the like most eligible bachelor and like have the best wedding of the entire season, and like all of this stuff has made a huge fuss, and everyone in London is going to their wedding. And the morning of the wedding, she's like, I don't actually want to marry him. And so she makes her twin sister marry him instead, which is like the very beginning of this book, and it's fantastic. I read it because my aunt was reading it at Thanksgiving one time. What's it called? It's called something like The Marriage Mistake or something.
I one of my Once Upon a Wedding books is kind of like that.
Anyway, it was really good. I'm gonna find it and tell you to read it.
I think it's not an unusual scenario. The only trouble I had when I tried to do that, I forget, it's The Next Best Bride is the one that I have with twins, that the one sister decides she's not made for marriage, but she actually works it out with her fiance, so he knows what's going on. The Wedding Trap. Okay. So do they work it out so it's legal? Because that's my issue, and that's why I had to fool around with my premise.
Basically, well, so it's
the names have to be on the license. You can't just switch off the names.
Their names are very similar. So it was Jeanette versus Janet.
Okay.
So their names had like one letter difference. Okay. And she signed her real name on the day of the wedding. So she didn't sign her sister's name. She signed her own name. So like the wedding, because the names didn't match, it wasn't legal, but they like basically had a secret wedding later
Okay.
that they made be real at the end.
Okay,
So
because
sorry,
that was one of the
they
issues
get together.
I always have. It's like I can't stand those logical flaws. It's like I really look at
they figure it out.
yeah.
And then there's a really cool scene, which maybe I should tell you after we're off the air.
Let me read it
so I don't spoil it for everyone. But the first one is called the wedding trap, and then there's the wife trap, and then there's the husband trap, and they're amazing, and they're all by Tracy Ann Warren.
Okay. Oh, Tracy Warren. Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
So good. Anyways,
I always look for good recommendations, so that's good.
This episode has, not only is it really long, but it's also full of recommendations for books.
That's a good thing.
If you want a movie to watch about Victoria and Albert, there's a really good, I think it must have been originally a BBC miniseries, but it's called Victoria and Albert, and it's like 5 hours long. It's as long as the Colin Firth Pride and Prejudice, which is also amazing.
Well,
but it's
the
like
more
it
I've
tells
learned
the
about
story
Queen
of how they
Victoria
meet and like fall in love, and like how he dies on her, and like
I'm not sure if I've seen that.
Follows their whole relationship in a really cool way.
I might have, because she's really a fascinating person.
Oh,
Victoria.
Yeah,
she's like an iconic, strong woman, but she always had a male influence. Like there was a man, I forget his name, who was her trusted confidant.
So one of the things that particular movie deals with is that she was not close to her mother because her mother was trying to control her.
Yes.
So she was close to her governess instead. But then it turns out later that her also controlling her in a way. So there's like maybe 3/4 of the way through the movie, there's a very big tension between Albert and the governess.
And
which is really interesting.
And you see that story when you look at any king or queen or royal who was raised and then became king or queen. You see that.
There's always lots of influences.
I studied the Tudors a lot, and what I find interesting, like I have a series I want to write about Elizabeth's reign, and so I've looked into her, and her story, her true story, is just so fascinating. It's like, how in the world did she ever become queen and reign for as long as she did fairly peacefully? Because
I think she had all of the men fighting amongst each other for her hand, and I think that's one of the things that kept them in line, is she could be like, okay, well, if you aren't nice to who I tell you need to be nice to, then sorry.
But she also had some very strong influences. And there were times when she was used, when she was younger, there were a lot of times when she was used as a pawn when she was younger. Lots of people wanted to marry her, even when she was, not in line for the throne. So I don't know, when you're a nexus of power like that, I don't know that you can ever get away from people trying to use you. And what I learned from looking at her long history was, you have to learn to control the people who are trying to control you, which is such a political skill that most of us don't have it. And in some ways, that's kind of what I'm saying about women in Victorian times or in Romance times, is one of the directives that men have in our culture is that they not be controlled by a woman. That's a really big knock for a woman to be controlled by, for a man to be controlled by a woman. Even now, there's all sorts of terms that are used, which I won't say. And yet we know women are always controlling their men in ways to make sure that their men don't feel controlled or humiliated by publicly announcing that control. And some women are better at that than others. I'm absolutely terrible at it, because I just tell my husband straight out, no, that's not the way it's going to work. And it's I probably caused us more trouble that way, because if I was just one of those women
I'm
who
that
could
type too. I'd rather have
teeter
like a
and
very vocal argument about something and like lose that argument than have one of those like subtle arguments that sounds like a conversation when like a third party is listening in. Because those arguments, like,
oops.
how do you know where you're going to go for dinner and you're very like polite about it? How do you know if they actually care where you're going to dinner? I don't know.
And you know, those are my favorite kinds of conversations. That's what I like to capture in the romance.
Yeah.
I'm not a big knockdown drag out like because so when I was growing up, which reveals my age, but oh well, I don't really care that much. You know, so the big bedroom door opening books were coming out and being shared, and so like there was the Flame in the Flower kind of books by Kathleen Woodiwiss, where it's one man, one woman.
Oh, I've
Once they
read
get
something by
together,
her. I really
once they get
liked it.
together, I loved her books. They're just she does a lot of fairy tale redoing too, but it's subtle. But the Flame in the Flower is the first one. But all of her books are they're about one man and one woman. And once the couple gets together, the things that keep them apart don't really drive them to other people. And then there was another, Bertree Small, I think, wrote a series of romances where the heroine was more adventurous. So she would have kind of like soap opera like serial affairs with this guy is her perfect guy. Then this, you know, then he goes off and is, you know, lost at sea or something and she's someone else. And then the guy comes back from sea and she has to decide on you know whether she's going back with him or not, and she's kidnapped and you know so she's it's like this, it's less about a relationship and more about a woman just sort of being adventurous, to be perfectly honest. And I gravitated more toward the ones that were focused on the relationship for some reason than the ones that were focused on the adventure. I don't know why.
I think the
That's
ones
very
focused, I
interesting.
mean, the ones focused on adventure, you can like read about adventure in any sort of like,
And
it doesn't have
I
to be in the
always felt
context
like
of romance, right?
and I always
Whereas
felt like the woman wasn't
romances are
real.
more about relationships and how people work and like, I don't know. Yeah.
But I always felt like the female character and even the male characters weren't real, that they were stereotypes. And I like to get beyond the
Oh,
stereotypes if I
yeah.
can. I mean,
Yeah.
you know, in comedy, stereotypes work really well because you can
Because
subvert
then
them.
you like, exactly. Yeah.
But in like
Yeah.
in a romance, you know, that's not a romantic comedy, but in a romance where it's supposed to be serious and, you know, volatile and working things out and love and everything, stereotypes kind of get in the way, I think, because none of us are
Yeah.
stereotypes. And every
Yeah.
woman who reads a romance is reading it for the, you know, the idea that, you know,
Yeah.
how do
Well, and I
I have
think
romance?
anyway, for me, when I've read a lot of different romances, and there are certain common things that you can see in how they end up making their relationship work at the end, but how they get there and the like specifics are different. And I think if you had those characters be stereotypical the whole way through, like in every book, you wouldn't learn those things that are common, because it would be like, oh well, that only works for the stereotype, it doesn't work for everyone. Whereas when you have a whole bunch of like books where it's not stereotypes and it's very specific to them, then you can see, oh okay, they're doing this thing that's worked in this other book that I read and this other book that I read, and like my friend did that and it worked for her, and like, so you start to see, okay, this is how you make a relationship work.
That's a really good point. I hadn't thought about it
And like,
that way before.
I don't know. I learn about real life from everything I read instead of
Or you
like
think you don't.
psychology classes and stuff.
Yeah,
Um,
psychology always baffled me.
yeah. There are
But
always
that
things
is
that still baffle you, but that's what you write about. Like, yeah. Anyways,
because I mean I do
so
love thrillers that delve into the psychology of killers.
oh
I
yeah,
went
those
through
are
a
really interesting too. So this is why, you
long,
know, yeah, all of my things have lots of different things in them. So, but
there
so
really isn't any kind of book I don't like to read, to be perfectly honest.
yeah, me too. I organize my books in the way that makes sense to me and not in the way that makes sense to anybody else. So I have like what I would consider literature, which is really like anything that I read in school.
I
And
know,
like
anything
most
you were
like
forced to read.
well, a lot of the stuff I read in school I was not actually forced to read. I read of my own volition, but I'll put in, so like it's got like Alexander Dumas and Shakespeare and Jane Austen and like Catcher in the Rye and Fitzgerald and like all of them. And then it's got like most like contemporary literary fiction that wouldn't actually, like, I would consider it literary fiction, but it might be classified as like women's fiction or something. So something like Eat, Pray, Love, I would put there.
So what about
Um,
Anne Tyler? Would you put something like by Anne Tyler in there, or is that too literary? Not
no, I
commercial
would
enough?
probably put something by her in there too. Because that's like, it's, I do big categories, I don't do little categories.
No, I was
And
just
then I
I
have,
just saw she won an award recently, and I was
mm,
like, I haven't
yeah,
read her in a long time. I should read something by her.
yeah.
I love
So
Elizabeth
then I
Gilbert.
have,
She's perfect.
I have, so there's literature and then there's fantasy, which is like fantasy, so it doesn't have anything to do with real life at all. So Harry Potter is not in that section.
Oh, interesting.
So fantasy is fantasy. And sometimes there are like romantic fantasies in there because romance isn't one of my big categories. Romance just fits in wherever it fits in based on the other things. So
Like
there's
in life.
literary and there's fantasy and then there's science fiction, which is like future science fiction, and like something like the Hunger Games would get put in there where it's not clear like when it happens or which part of time it fits into, but it probably started from real life and then like progressed. And then I have historical fiction, and that's where Harry Potter is. And like all the historical romances and all of the like historical novels and all like any fantasy book that has anything to do with the real world is in there. So like urban fantasy is in there.
Interesting. And why do you think you categorize it that way?
Because it just makes sense to me. Like if it has something to do with the real world, then it's a certain type of book. And it's a what if the real world were a little bit different. And sometimes that little bit different is there's magic, and sometimes that little bit different is like some random person you've never heard of has something to do with like some major historical event and then got erased from history, or sometimes it's like a romance that happened in the past that isn't like literary.
So Tolkien would be fantasy or history?
Tolkien is fantasy
Okay. I mean, because
because
he is really
because
basically recasting World War One.
right, but that's not overt, right?
I
Like there's
agree.
the
I just was
elves don't
curious.
like sail away and then end up in England. They sail away and go into like an alternate universe. So like there's parallels to history and there's parallels to like various issues of race and like nationality and all of that, but it's metaphorical as
Okay.
opposed to literal. Whereas I mean Harry
Okay.
Potter has a lot of the same themes, but because it's like the real world has this whole like other half to it that we don't know about. So it's a real world what if
Yeah,
as
no,
opposed to a
I
fantasy
definitely
world
see
what if.
that. I like that the
Yeah.
way you define it. I was just curious. Now, so like Peter Pan kind of
Peter Pan
crosses
would
the,
be in no, Peter Pan would be in the historical fiction side
so there's
because
no
they
doubt
start
in
out
your
in real
mind.
life.
They
Yeah.
do, and they go back to real life. Yeah. Interesting. Interesting.
Yeah. Yeah. It's very straightforward. But there's like books that are romances in all of those. Like one of my favorite romances is I don't know if you've read Lois McMaster Bujold's Miles
Mhm.
books, but the
I
one
love
where he
him.
meets a
Miles is great.
Cotterine, he's amazing. The one where he meets a Cotterine, that's like my favorite romance of all time, and it's in the science fiction section.
And you have to remember, she was writing that back when any
Yeah,
icky boy girl stuff was looked askance at, and she did that so
she's
perfectly.
an amazing author.
Yeah, she really is.
Yeah, I
Yeah,
I
and
love
those, I
everything
mean,
of hers.
those romantic development, that romantic development in her books. probably all the relationships in those books would be great for writers who are trying to figure out how to do authentic relationships.
Oh
I
yeah,
think
she was
Lois
really good at like real
McMaster-Bujold
people.
and Connie Willis are both very good at real people in real relationships. Connie Willis is less romancy, I would say, in
Hmm.
terms of you don't feel like with Miles and Ekaterina, you don't feel the romantic tension so much, but
Hmm.
she does do very good relationships, and she does very relatable people. In the very first story that I read by Connie Willis was a really short story, and I think of it sometimes as a way women can get a women's type story into the science fiction world, and it was about like a vacuum cleaner that we kind of have now with Roomba, but didn't back then. That takes a wedding ring, and she has to figure out how to get it back, and because it's an interesting concept that there's this vacuum cleaner and there's this robotic vacuum cleaner, and it's taken something and she doesn't have any way to get it back, and it's just a very short story, but it's so real because how many people know that you know that moment when you lose something and it's just right there, but how do you
But
get
you
it
can't
back?
get to it. Like when you drop your like favorite earrings down the drain in the sink.
Exactly.
The
And you're
same
like,
thing.
is it really going to be worth it to take that elbow off?
Yeah.
And how do you do that to begin with? So,
And did it really fall down the sink or did it fall down your shirt?
did it really? Yeah.
That's happened to my sister.
Oh,
We had to
no.
take the sink apart and it wasn't there. It was like in her shirt.
Uh, oh. And she found that out after the sink? Oh, my goodness. That would
Yeah.
not be good.
Yeah. She found out after the sink. Yeah, that was an exciting afternoon.
But at least she knows how to take the sink apart. So that's good.
No, I think she had my uncle do it for her.
Oh. Oh, so he's probably not that happy with that story.
Yeah, well, I don't know. I wasn't involved in most of it because I don't know how to take sinks apart. So I
You
couldn't
just,
really help out all that.
that's the kind of moment where you stay away until it's done, and then you come in
Yeah,
to kind of see how it
yeah,
ended.
yeah. So it ended good, but yeah, exactly. I can do all sorts of other things like, take dishwashers apart, but like messing with the sink is beyond me.
Well, plumbing is finicky too.
Yeah, yeah. Anyway, so
I'm
what should we be
sorry.
most
I told
excited
you I would
about?
take you off topic.
Yeah, I think I might split this into two pieces. But what should we be most excited about with reading A Fairy Tale Bride?
What should we be most excited about with reading A Fairy Tale Bride? Hmm. Um, if you like the Cinderella myth,
Mm-hmm.
um, it is another take on what exactly it means to get the man. So
Mm-hmm.
he's not a prince, he's a duke, but he's pretty powerful, and um, he's pretty much pig-headed. And so it's like, okay, is he an impenetrable wall that she's never going to be able to get through, or is she going to be able to, bring the wall down in any way? And I always think that with Cinderella, that's a story we never get. What happens
Mm-hmm.
after they get married? And there have been some good uh, revisionist fairy tales about after the wedding. I definitely have to acknowledge those, but it, for every girl who grew up with the Disney version of
Yeah,
you
the
end
Disney
with the
version
wedding.
is
Yeah, you end
Disney
with the wedding.
versions
It's
of
like,
everything is like
but you don't end with the wedding.
oversimplified.
You start with the wedding. The wedding is a huge start, and then there's so much stuff after that. So
Yeah.
it's a way of looking at, what would Cinderella do if she's this sweet girl
Who's
who
used to doing all the
likes
work and
everybody to get
suddenly is a
along.
princess. Like,
And now, yeah,
does
and
she
now
let the
she
maids
not
out
only has to
their
get
jobs
along,
or
but
does she try and do it for them?
Exactly.
Yeah.
And then the other side of it is, um, you know, looking at Simon at the Duke, and I get hit on this a lot, so I'll mention it now, that a lot of people think that his internal conflict that drives everything he does for a long time is bogus, that no one would do that. And I'm not sure, I mean, you know, that was part of the thing that interested me in writing the story, is what would you do if you believe, um, you know, in what you've been taught, that blood is important and that your family lineage is your blood and your honor, and you find out that you are not a legitimate heir. Um, so what does that mean to you?
Yeah.
Do you say, okay, then I'm going to find it, because legally you can't step away. You know, there's no provision in the law. If you were seen as, you know, if the old Duke acknowledged you as a legal son, you were a legal son. No one, there
Yeah.
were no DNA tests back then,
Yeah.
because they really didn't want to know. You know, they, you know, I mean, I think for most of them, they didn't really care that much, as long as there was someone to inherit all this property and carry down
Yeah.
the line. So I see the argument that, you know, some readers and editors have had, but that was part of what I was exploring, is how far do you go to protect
Yeah.
what you actually believe in. and and so, you know, I had kind of a convoluted solution for that at the end so that I could get a happy ending out of it. um, but I tried to make it consistent. It's like, he never needs to give up his belief in what he believes in. He just needs to expand it out a little bit,
Yeah.
and maybe have a few facts, because I do think that's one of the things in family stories that is always the most interesting. It's the secrets that
Hmm.
sometimes help you understand what's going on. And
Yeah.
yet people jealously guard them and don't want to tell them, because sometimes it's embarrassing. Sometimes you're afraid you'll lose trust, or you'll lose respect, or you'll lose,
Hmm.
you know, you'll lose the person completely. And so you hold on to these, you know, secrets that when they come out actually can make things better or make them worse, depending
Yeah.
depending on what the plot
Yeah.
needs for the moment.
Well, that's really interesting that you mentioned the whole like if the dad says you're legitimate, then you're legitimate thing, because um in my fantasy sort of thriller series, the series is called Intrigue, and the first book I like am probably a third of the way through it, but I know the whole story, so it's like a 6 book series. Um, and I got stuck at this one point in the first book, and I like couldn't write anything for a week because I couldn't figure out what was going on with like the culture of this city. And then I finally realized, like, because they use essentially seduction um, as a way of politicking.
Mm-hmm.
So like
Mm-hmm.
they'll like sleeping around is totally okay and nobody cares. What matters is like what family you are acknowledged to be from.
And is it
And
an
nobody cares
acknowledgement, or
what.
is it a DNA acknowledgement?
No,
Oh,
it's like
DNA.
you're part of our family, so you're part of
Okay.
our family. Um, it's not. It doesn't. And usually it's like if your mom is part of a family, then you are raised as part of that family, regardless of
Okay.
who like
So like
actually
the
fathered you.
Jewish tradition.
Yeah, patriarchal society. Anyway, so like it took me a really long time to figure out because like they were just okay with people being illegitimate. Like it just didn't.
You're like,
And
why
I was
is
like
that? What does it
going from
mean?
like it's like a sort of a medieval type of you know fantasy world, and in most fantasy that's set in the Middle Ages, that's like backwards.
Mm-hmm.
And so
Mm-hmm.
once I realized, oh, that's why I'm stuck. I'm like thinking this is more like a normal fantasy story than it actually is. Then I was like, oh, okay, whatever, cool. Um, but yeah, that whole it's interesting because one of the characters that I have is going to be from a very different culture, and she's going to have issues adapting. So
Yeah, I mean,
I'm
and
excited
that sounds
to.
like it would. If you're if you have a
Yeah,
different definition of family and legitimacy.
yeah,
Um,
and she comes from a place where fidelity is very important. Um, and
that
then
would,
she's
yeah,
put
that would
into
be a
a
fun
culture where
exploration.
like it's just not.
Well, fidelity in one sense, but my
It's
guess
well,
is that
it's
fidelity
family
is
loyalty,
extremely
but it's
important
not
to
sexual
us. Exactly.
fidelity.
Fidelity to
Yeah,
the family is probably extremely important. So
yeah,
I don't think we ever have a culture where fidelity of some sort is not, but where it's totally defined to the male-female relationship.
yeah,
And that's your whole concept. Because I think that's, I mean, right now, I think if you were to say fidelity to a lot of people, they would think of it in terms of a romantic relationship,
oh yeah,
not a
absolutely.
parent-child relationship or a
Yeah,
family relationship. So
yeah,
yeah, I do think we have a cultural bias on that concept.
yeah.
That sounds like it would be really fun to play with.
I'm definitely having fun with it. I'm trying to like I want to like just go on that one, but I have to finish the Sorceress and Beastly one first.
Yes, you do. You do.
It's really hard because like I want to go on both of them at the same time, and I feel like I need to finish the one first.
Well, I
So
mean, sometimes, I mean, I'll work on two or three projects at the same time. So you can do that, but you just need to compartmentalize them,
yeah,
if you can.
yeah.
Some people are better just focusing on one thing because they don't like the worlds mingle. But since I
Oh
write
no, there's
different
never
kinds of
any
things,
crossover in my head.
oh yeah, so
I never have
maybe
that problem.
you can reward yourself by writing a little bit on the new one after you've got your Sorceress and
Yeah,
Beastly word count.
yeah, yeah. Well, thank you. We had a super long, fascinating
I'm sorry
conversation.
about that.
No, it's
I could
okay.
talk forever.
Me too. And we like covered all of my favorite topics in one conversation. Books and zoology and like
History.
gender issues and
Yes.
history and yeah, and how like you could use fantasy and fiction to explore things that are not easy to talk about in real life. So I've
Yes,
had a lot of fun.
exactly. I did too. Thank you for inviting me.
Yeah, thank you for coming. Um, where should readers find you?
They can find me on my website, kellymcclymer.com. Everything I do is under Kelly McClymer.
Okay.
Once I married my husband and took his name, I'm like, you're never getting it back. I don't care what you do. So he stays married to me. That way it's safer. Um, but I'm on Facebook under Kelly McClymer, or Kelly McClymer Books is my page. I'm trying to be better about talking to people on Facebook, but I'm not.
Facebook is hard.
It is hard. And I know I said that I'm not writing a historical romance right now, which is true, but I do have one book that is a little more cynical look at romance, historical romance, a little not quite as lighthearted as my Once Upon a Wedding series, that hasn't been published yet. And so if readers are interested, they can join my readers group and get it for free. It's called
Okay.
Galatea's Revenge, and that's on my website if anyone is interested in just trying me out. But fair warning, it's the book's going to have to be edited. I just got fabulous comment from one of my early readers about something that I could work on, that I could improve in the book, and I'm like, oh, thank you, this is so wonderful, I love it. So it'll be probably a year before the book is finished. So if you like to read, no, I mean it's complete, but before it's finished editing and revisions. So if you like to read more polished books, don't download it. And if you're curious to see what a third, fourth draft looks like before you really dive in, feel free. You may like it, you may not. You can find that on my website, kellymcclymer.com.
Awesome. Thank you.
Thank you.
I look forward to reading your book a lot.
Okay.